The day my mother introduced me to her book club, she said, and I quote, "This is Natalia. She's the one we don't worry about academically." She laughed. 7 women laughed with her. My brother Marcus, standing beside her with his Yale acceptance letter still warm from the printer, laughed the loudest. I was 17. I smiled. I fixed my expression into something neutral and pleasant, the way you do when you've already learned that showing pain only gives people more to work with. I didn't say a word. That was the moment I understood something, not with anger, but with a quiet, bone-deep clarity that I've carried ever since. The people who dismiss you the most completely are the ones who will one day need you the most desperately. I just had to be patient enough to let it happen. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, not my parents, not Marcus, not a single woman sitting in that living room with her teacup, was what I had been doing every night in my bedroom for 2 years while they assumed I was drifting. And 23 years later, when $47 million landed in my account on a Tuesday morning in March, the first call I received wasn't from a bank. It was from my mother, crying, asking for help. But here's what makes this story different from every family betrayal story you've ever heard. I didn't say no. What I did instead was so much more permanent than no. Before I take you back to where all of this truly began, I just want to pause for a second. If you're watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, drop it in the comments. Just your city or your country and the time. I find it quietly beautiful that stories like this travel to people at all different hours, in all different places. It takes 2 seconds, and I read every single one. Okay, now let me tell you everything.
I grew up in a house in suburban Ohio, Westerville, in a 4-bedroom colonial with a manicured front lawn that my father treated like a personal achievement. From the outside, we were the image of a family that had figured things out. My father, Robert, managed commercial real estate for a regional firm. My mother, Patricia, ran the household with the precision of a woman who believed that control and love were the same thing. And my brother Marcus was their proof. Their evidence that they had done everything right. Marcus got straight A's from the age of 6. He won competitions. He quoted things at dinner that made my father look at him the way some people look at sunsets, like they couldn't believe something that extraordinary belonged to them. And then there was me. I want to be precise here because the story only works if you understand what was actually happening. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't failing.
I was different. I processed things differently. I was interested in different things. I moved through the world at a different frequency, and in a house that had already decided what intelligence looked like, what worth looked like. Different meant lesser. My grades were average, mostly B's, a few C's in subjects that couldn't hold my attention, occasional A's in things nobody celebrated. Shop class, a computer elective, a business fundamentals course that the school offered as a filler credit. My parents never yelled at me about my grades. That would have required a kind of investment they had already quietly withdrawn. Instead, they did something quieter and far more corrosive. They stopped expecting. I'd bring home a report card, and my mother would glance at it, nod with a thin smile, and say something like, "Well, you're consistent, Natalia." My father would look up, grunt, and return to his newspaper. But when Marcus brought home a 4.0, there was a dinner out, phone calls to grandparents, a warmth that moved through the whole house for days, like sunlight through a window I wasn't standing near. By the time I was 14, I had been sorted. In my family's taxonomy, Marcus was the smart one. I was the other one, and the other one learned, quietly, efficiently, without bitterness, to become invisible. What they never understood about making someone invisible is this: invisible people see everything. The story my family told about me was simple, and it never changed. Natalia is sweet. Natalia will find her way, maybe something practical. She's good with her hands, good with people. My mother said this the way you tell someone their plain daughter has a lovely personality. It was meant kindly. That almost made it worse. When I didn't get into any four-year universities, my parents weren't surprised. My father drove me to community college orientation in near total silence and shook my hand in the parking lot afterward like I was a distant colleague he wasn't sure he'd see again. My mother cried that night. I heard her through the wall, but not in front of me. She would never let me see that. She needed me to believe she had accepted it. Marcus, by then, was at Yale studying economics. He called home every Sunday. My parents gathered around the speakerphone like it was sacred. I enrolled in 18 credits at Columbus State, worked 30 hours a week at a data entry company handling logistics software for freight companies, and spent every remaining hour doing what I had been doing since I was 15, teaching myself to code. Not beginner code, not the HTML they taught in intro classes. I mean serious, structural, architectural software development. I had found a forum at 15. This was 2001, early internet. The kind of forum that looked like text on a dark screen. And I had started asking questions. Dumb questions at first, then sharper ones. Then questions that the senior developers started responding to with something that felt, to a girl who rarely received it at home, like respect. I was building things, small things, then larger things, then things I didn't yet have names for, and no one in my family knew. At 16, I built a basic inventory system for a hardware store 2 blocks from my house. The owner, a quiet man named Gerald Haas, had been running everything by hand. I built him a desktop database that saved him 12 hours a week and reduced his ordering errors dramatically. He paid me $400 in cash and shook my hand and said, "You've got a real mind, young lady." I walked home with that $400 and those words, and I held both of them like they were the only warmth available. Because at that moment, they were. I reinvested every dollar into books, courses, hardware. I kept building. By the time my father shook my hand in that community college parking lot, I had $11,000 in savings, 3 small software clients paying monthly retainers, and an idea I could not stop thinking about. That idea would eventually be worth more than everything my family had built across 4 generations combined. But first, I had to survive being dismissed a little while longer. The years between 20 and 27 were the years my family's narrative about me hardened into something permanent. Marcus graduated Yale with honors, entered consulting in New York, and proceeded to build a career that my parents described to everyone, neighbors, cousins, people at church, with a specificity and warmth they never once directed at me. They knew his salary. They quoted it casually the way some people mention the weather. They visited his Manhattan apartment twice a year and came back luminous with reflected pride. When they visited me, which happened roughly once every 14 months, they walked through my 1-bedroom Columbus apartment with the polite discomfort of people touring somewhere they weren't sure they belonged. "It's cozy," my mother would say. "Keeping yourself busy?" my father would ask. What I was doing was this. I had founded a company, a registered LLC, a small shared office, 3 full-time software clients, and a product I had been building for years, a supply chain visibility platform that let mid-size freight and logistics companies see in real time exactly where everything in their network was, what condition it was in, and what was about to go wrong before it did. This was 2008. The tools that existed for this were either built for massive enterprise companies or so expensive that mid-market operators couldn't touch them. Nobody was building for the middle. I was. 2 paying clients by year 1, 7 by year 2. My first employee, a developer named Kofi, I found through the same kind of forum that had first taught me, hired in year 3. I told my family none of this, not out of secrecy, out of experience. I had learned what happened when I mentioned my work before it was undeniable. It became the computer thing. It became something to smile at and move past. I had learned that if you announce something to people who've already written you off, they will find a way to keep you small, even inside the announcement. So I decided I would wait until the truth was loud enough that no one could talk over it. My company had its first $1 million revenue year when I was 29. I told no one. I sat with it alone in my office, and I felt something I can only describe as a deep, private completeness. Like I had been right about myself all along, and now the world was beginning to agree. There is a particular loneliness in building something in silence, and I carried it for years. Not because I needed applause. I had stopped needing applause from my family sometime around 19, when I understood that approval from people who don't understand what you've built is just noise in a familiar voice. What I felt during those years wasn't longing. It was something more like observation, like watching an experiment run to its natural conclusion without interfering. By 32, my company had 41 employees, offices in Columbus and Atlanta, and contracts with 17 logistics companies moving north of $2 billion in goods annually. I had turned down 2 acquisition offers, both under $15 million, both from buyers who wanted our technology without paying its actual worth. My name was beginning to appear in Ohio business press. Small mentions, trade publications mostly. My parents, to my knowledge, read none of it. What they read were Marcus's LinkedIn updates. He had left consulting and moved into private equity. He posted the language of that world. Thought leadership pieces, conference photos, deal announcements written in the careful vagueness of people not allowed to say exactly how much money was involved. My father had begun forwarding me these posts. No commentary, just the forward, as if proximity to Marcus's success was a form of instruction. I archived every single one. There is something a father tells you when he forwards his son's LinkedIn posts to his daughter. He tells you exactly what kind of reckoning is coming, and exactly who will be unprepared for it. The Christmas I was 34 was the one that reset my internal clock entirely. I drove to Westerville in my 4-year-old Honda Accord. I had long since stopped performing anything for my family, and a newer car would have required explanation I wasn't willing to give. Marcus flew business class from New York. My father drove to the airport to pick him up personally. I parked my own car in the driveway. Christmas Eve dinner was the full production. Good china, candles, my mother's standing rib roast, extended family. My Aunt Carol, her husband Don, my cousin Brittany and her fiancé, the couple from down the street who had been coming for as long as I could remember. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, my Uncle Don asked the table, the way uncles do. "So what is everybody up to these days work-wise?" Marcus went first. He described a recent deal, a portfolio acquisition, numbers in the tens of millions, a team that had ground through 18-hour days and come out the other side. The table leaned in. My father nodded with that specific pride I had been cataloging since childhood. That private, proprietary pride that was never available to me. My mother touched her pearls. Then Don looked across the table at me. "Natalia, what are you up to these days?" And before I could draw a single breath, I need you to hear this clearly because I have replayed it more times than I can count. My mother said, "Natalia's still doing her computer thing. Her computer thing. 41 employees, contracts with companies moving billions in freight, 8 years of building, 2 acquisition offers declined, and from the woman who raised me, her computer thing. The table moved on. Dessert was served. I ate my pie and smiled and said nothing. But something in me closed that night, quietly, permanently, like a door swinging shut in a room nobody is watching. Not anger, not tears, something colder and more final than either of those. I had given my family every opportunity to see me. They had chosen consistently and completely not to look, and that meant I was free. Completely, finally, irrevocably free. Because the version of me they had frozen in their minds, the computer thing version, the non-academic version, the girl who wasn't worth worrying about, that version had no idea what was coming. But the actual version of me did. And she had been building quietly for a very long time. The acquisition offer came in February, 3 months after that Christmas dinner. By 35, I had declined 4 offers to buy my company. The 5th was different. It came from a logistics technology company, I'll call them North Vector, that had spent the previous 2 years acquiring mid-market supply chain platforms and building them into an integrated suite. They were PE-backed, aggressive, and growing fast. And our platform was the integration layer they were missing. They weren't subtle about wanting it. Their opening offer was $31 million. I didn't call my father. I didn't call Marcus. I called Sandra Cho, my lawyer since year 3, and told her to counter. We countered at $52 million. Not because that was my number, but because I needed to understand their urgency. They came back at $38 million within 72 hours. That told me everything. Sandra and I had done our research. We knew North Vector's PE Backers Fund timeline. We knew they had a customer conference in May where they planned to announce a complete integrated product suite, which meant they needed our platform locked in before April. We had leverage, real leverage, and we used every bit of it. 11 weeks of negotiation, and on a Tuesday morning in March, the final number, $47.3 million cash, hit my account. I sat at my desk and looked at the number on my screen for a long time. Long enough that my assistant knocked on my office door to check on me. I told her everything was fine. Then I went back to work. What I had not done, at any point in this process, was tell my family I was selling my company, because my family did not know I had a company. Let me be precise. My mother knew I did the computer thing. My father knew I did software work. Marcus knew I ran some kind of small tech business. Not one of them knew it had 41 employees, $8 million in annual recurring revenue, and had just been acquired for $47.3 million. Not one of them had ever asked enough questions to find out. What followed the acquisition, I did not engineer, but I also did nothing to stop. The first domino was Marcus. His private equity firm had been evaluating acquisition targets in the supply chain visibility space. They had, in fact, reviewed materials on my company months before the North Vector deal closed. Marcus had been in those meetings. He had reviewed the materials. He had recommended against pursuing the acquisition, citing, and I was told this by a mutual contact who had been in that room, insufficient founder credibility for a company of that scale. He did not recognize the founder's name. He had not recognized his own sister. Let that stay with you for a moment. My brother sat in a conference room in New York and recommended against acquiring his sister's company because he didn't believe the founder had enough institutional credibility. And he didn't know it was her because he had never paid close enough attention to what she actually built. When I found out, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something much quieter and much heavier. The experiment had finished running. The result was exactly as predicted, and it was sadder than I had expected it to be. But before I could sit with that sadness for very long, my mother called. It was a Thursday evening, 8 weeks after the wire transfer. I was at home, a real home now, 4 bedrooms on a quiet Columbus street, a garden I was learning to keep, when my phone lit up with my mother's name. She opened with the weather, then my health. Then, carefully, she mentioned she had heard something through a friend of Carol's about a tech acquisition. A Columbus company? I said nothing. She said the name North Vector. I said, "What about them? Were you involved in that?" "I founded the company they acquired," I said. Yes. The silence on the line had a texture I had never felt from her before. Not shock exactly. More like the specific vertigo of someone who has just realized the map they've been holding is wrong, has always been wrong, and the terrain they're standing in is not what they thought. "The computer thing?" she said. "The software company," I said. "Yes." Another silence. "How much—" She stopped. "I mean, Carol's friend mentioned a number, but surely— 47.3 million, I said, before tax. I heard her sit down. The soft sound of a chair receiving weight. What happened in the following 72 hours was the fastest recalibration my family had ever performed. My father called the next morning. He said, "Sweetheart." He almost never called me sweetheart. It was usually Natalia, in the tone of a man who is mildly inconvenienced by the need to say the name. And there was something in it this time that I didn't know how to categorize. A kind of careful, late-arriving tenderness. He asked questions. Real ones. How long had I been building it? How many employees? What exactly did the software do? He asked in the slow, attentive voice of a man assembling a picture he is embarrassed not to have already. I answered everything, calmly, without the satisfaction I might have performed 2 years earlier, because I had grown past needing the satisfaction to land visibly. The facts were enough. The facts had always been enough. At the end of the call, my father's voice did something it had never done in my direction. It softened. "I didn't know," he said. "I really didn't know what you were doing all those years." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you—" "Because," I said, and I chose these words very carefully, "every time I mentioned my work, it became the computer thing, so I stopped mentioning it." The silence that followed was the longest he had ever given me. Marcus called on a Saturday. He was good at talking. He had always been good at talking. And he circled the conversation for a while using the careful language of someone trained in rooms where error is managed rather than admitted. He said things like, "I want to make sure I understand the full picture," and "I should have known more about what you were building." I let him finish. Then I said, "You did see what I was building, Marcus. Your firm reviewed acquisition materials on my company. You were in those meetings. You passed on recommending the deal." The silence from Marcus was different from my parents' silences, sharper, more aware of what it contained. "I didn't recognize—" "I know," I said. "You didn't recognize my name." I left space after that. I didn't fill it. I didn't soften it. I didn't move toward him to make it easier. Some truths need to stand in the room by themselves for a moment. That was one of them. There is a kind of proof that needs no explanation. It simply exists. And now it existed between Marcus and me, cleanly, undeniably, with nowhere for either of us to hide from it. Here is what actually changed, and I want to be honest here because real stories are not movies. What changed was structural, quiet, permanent. 3 months after closing, I was approached by the PE firm that had backed North Vector to consult on 2 additional acquisitions. They had seen how our deal performed in due diligence, knew my background, and wanted my judgment on the next targets. 6 months after that, I had formalized a consulting arrangement. 3 deals simultaneously, each with meaningful fees. A year after The Wire hit, I was a recognized figure in the Midwest tech ecosystem in a way that was simply beyond argument. Profile pieces, speaking invitations, introductions that arrived without me needing to request them, and my family's world, the Westerville neighbors, the church community, my Aunt Carol, Dawn, Brittany, all of these people began to encounter my name and my story in the world before my family could frame it for them. My mother's friend called her to ask if her daughter was the Natalia Archer on the Columbus Business First cover. She was. My father was at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon when a speaker used my company's acquisition as a local success story case study. He sat in that room and heard my work described to a room full of strangers, people who would never have dismissed it as the computer thing. And he had to absorb that in public, alone. Marcus had to explain to a colleague at his own firm why he had passed on recommending the acquisition of his sister's company. I did none of this. I simply stopped hiding. And the world, which had always been watching whether I knew it or not, did the rest. The most devastating thing you can do to people who have underestimated you is not prove them wrong yourself. It is to let the world prove them wrong, in public, in front of people they respect, while they stand there watching and there is nothing left to say. Back to my mother's call, the one I mentioned at the very beginning, the crying, the asking for help. This was 8 months after the acquisition closed. My father's firm, the regional real estate company he had managed for 30 years, had itself been acquired by a larger national group. He had been offered a graceful exit, a severance package, a courtesy title that meant nothing, and a clear signal that his era was over. He was 63. He had a modest retirement account, a house with some equity, and a life that had been calibrated to a salary that would no longer exist. Marcus had his own complications, a fund position in serious distress, a partnership track quietly delayed. My mother called on a Wednesday evening, and she did not open with the weather. She talked around it for a while. She had always been better at circling than landing. And then she said, "Natalia, I think we might need some guidance. Your father would never ask himself, you know how he is, but I think we need your help." She paused. "Financially," she said, "and maybe just in general." Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. Patricia Archer, who had run our household like a corporation and the neighborhood like a dynasty, sounded genuinely frightened. And underneath the fear, something else, something she had never offered me before, not directly. Something that sounded for the first time like actual need, not performance, not management, need. I let the silence hold for just a moment. What I did next was not what they expected. And I have thought about it many times since, because it is the part of this story I feel most quietly settled about. I helped them. I know that isn't the ending that the story seems to be building toward. But here is why it was more significant, for all of us, than any version of refusal would have been. I arranged a meeting. Myself, my parents, and a financial advisor I deeply trusted. We sat at my dining room table, in my house, in the city where I had built everything without their attention, and I spent 4 hours going through their actual financial situation with a clarity and care they had never experienced from me because they had never asked for it. I helped my father negotiate a genuinely better severance package than the one he'd been offered. I connected him with 2 people in the commercial real estate space who brought him in as a real consultant. Not a courtesy title, actual substantive work, actual income. I set up a modest investment account for my parents. Not extravagant, proportionate, enough to give them real stability going forward. And then I did the thing that I think carried more weight than any of it. I sat across from my mother at my kitchen table, just the two of us, tea going cold between us, and I told her the full timeline. Gerald Haas and the hardware store in 2001, the forum at 15, the $400, the first clients, the years of building while she thought I was doing the computer thing, the 4 acquisition offers declined, the 11 weeks of final negotiation. I told her everything, not to wound her,